This time on the Prop Master, well, we're going to build one of these. And we learned from early diagrams and video games around Empire Strikes Back that this is what's called a mini concussion missile. Sort of a beefed up version of the wrist rockets that the super battle droids have. Nasty stuff, but what's that? Oh, in Return of the Jedi, we learned this is not a missile. This is a wrist-mounted blaster that Boba Fett uses to take pot shots at Luke during the... What's that? Oh. Okay, so in The Mandalorian, we see that these little holes in the front are something called whistling birds. Only Boba, I guess, has twice as many of them. So, honestly, I have no idea what this thing is, but we're going to build one. That's right, we finally get started on the last of the major components for Boba's left Vambrace. But before we can get started on that, I need to remind you that it's extremely important for you to subscribe to my channel. It's no big deal for you, it doesn't really affect you in any way, but it's hugely helpful for my channel. I'm really trying to get to 30,000 subscribers so I can do some helpful things for the channel. But YouTube won't let me do those things until I have 30,000 subscribers. Also, if you can, go check out my Patreon account. It's hugely helpful for the channel. You'll get a few perks out of it as well. And there are a lot of expenses that, honestly, I can't do unless I can make a little bit more money with the channel. I've got some equipment that could definitely stand to be updated, as you can see from the rainbow effects on the video, but I can't really justify making spending that kind of money unless I've got some more money coming in. So anything that y'all can do would be hugely helpful. But I've wasted enough time and we've got a lot to do on this, so let's get to work. So before we get started on this is another one of those projects where we don't really have that much in the way of materials, so let's go ahead and talk about it before we get started. The first thing, obviously, you're going to want is the template, which is a little bit different this time. It's a bit more of a diagram that's to scale. We do have these drill guides up here, which, kind of a template, but, either way, you need that. You're also going to need some of this. It's an irrigation pipe. It's pretty common in the US. When you buy this, it's probably going to be listed as a 1/2-inch irrigation pipe. That's the internal diameter. The important thing is that it's a pipe that is outside diameter is 7/8 of an inch or 22 millimeters. You're also going to need some of this 3/4 inch PVC. That's also the internal diameter. And in both cases here, we're not going to need a whole lot of it. We're going to need like 4 3/4 inches of the irrigation pipe and 3 5/8 inches of the PVC. So if you just got some scrap, that's going to be fine. You're also going to need a 6-inch long carriage bolt. It's a 1/4 inch, which is the important thing. Whatever thread pitch you can find will work fine, as long as you have a nut that also fits on it. Try to get the skinny, the not real fat nuts. The thinner is better in this case. And you're going to need a piece of 3/4 inch thick MDF. That's really the only thing I can think of that's going to work for this project. If you've got some kind of milling plastic, that would work even better, but I don't have any access to anything like that. Was it like Delrin or something like that? It doesn't have to be a huge piece. This is about 2.5 to 3 inches across. And that's pretty much the whole piece. Oh, almost forgot one thing. You're going to need a 1/4 inch by 3 inch steel nipple. This is called a 1/4 inch, but it's by no means a 1/4 inch on the inside or the outside. The important dimension on this is that its outside diameter is 9/16 or 14 millimeters. So it doesn't have to be steel. If you can find something else that has those dimensions, that'll work just fine. There are a few other things. You're gonna need a couple of 25 milliliter size epoxy. I'm going with the JB Weld, which is a steel reinforced epoxy, primarily because it's designed to be drilled and tapped, so I know it's going to give me a nice drill hole. It's not the easiest thing to work with, but I know that it'll give me a nice clean drill hole basically. I don't think 1's enough, 2's going to be too much, but better too much than not enough. Now, there's also some tools that we haven't used before that are a little different that we want to go ahead and talk about a little bit. You're going to want to use, or you're going to want to have a couple of hole saws. It's basically just a type of drill bit. You want to make sure that you have the type that has the pilot bit, and make sure that it's a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter bit. It's in here. You need a 1.5 inch hole saw, which is 38 millimeters, and you're also going to need it's a 3/4, which is 19 millimeters, but they both have the 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter pilot bit. Also, this is something that we haven't used before. This is a pipe cutter, and it's a pretty cheap little tool, and it's real handy for making fairly square cuts and clean cuts on pipes, especially on steel pipes. It'll also work on these 2 plastic ones as well. And you're going to want some kind of a punch. You can, in a pinch, get away with using a nail, but you want to get really precise on this one, and so you want to make sure that you've got a nice clean punch that you can easily get a very precise, especially when we're doing these screw punches. You have to get in a real precise position there. 2 more things. You're probably going to want to get a 1/4 inch dowel. This is going to come in handy in the very tip down here. And speaking of that, you might want to try to find the very smallest dowel you can find, preferably a 1/8 of an inch. This one's actually a little bigger than that, but it's the smallest one I could find. And luckily these are pretty cheap because it's really basically just that very tip of the blaster portion. And you don't have to, but you might want to go ahead and get a 1/4 inch aluminum rod. In a pinch, you can go ahead and use some of the 1/4 inch wooden dowel. It's just not going to be quite as precise as the aluminum. Well, you'll understand more when we get to it, and you can make that decision then. And with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started on this. So the first thing we want to do is to cut this 3 inch nipple down to 13/16 or 21 millimeters. And to do that using, if you could use a miter box and a hacksaw, but this is a much easier and more accurate way of doing it. Now, if you've got a really accurate metal cutting chop saw that'll give you a super clean 90-degree angle, then I would use that, absolutely. Because the squarer you can make this, the better it's all going to fit together in the end. So basically you just clamp this in. There's a couple of wheels here at the top and a blade at the bottom, and kind of get it where it holds it in position. And normally you'd want to clamp this pipe down, but I'm just going to grab a pair of pliers, or I'll just grab some vice grips here. And I don't want the threaded area, so I can go ahead and clamp it down pretty well on that. Okay, and you just tighten it to where it's reasonably tight. You should just have one little bit of a line there. If you get more than one, then you're having some problems. You want to tighten it up a little more and try again. Give it a turn. Not wanting to tighten anymore, so it's not usually this difficult. I'm not sure what's going on here. Just the usual, I'm filming it. Nice clean cut. So now we need to go ahead and make our measurement. And I want to measure this to 13/16. I don't have to be super precise with this, just roughly. Okay, and I'm just going to line the blade up with where I want the cut. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and clamp on there. A little better. Okay. And here's our piece. Notice that we didn't need this yet, but it does have our lengths on it. Okay. Now I need a 4 3/4 inch section of this piece here. And I'm just going to cut this off on the bandsaw because it's a lot faster. But let me cut this and I'll be right back. There we go. 1 4 3/4 inches section of irrigation pipe. Now we can go ahead and start working with our quick weld. This is just a quicker setting epoxy version of the regular JB Weld, which is just a steel reinforced epoxy. Quicker this may be, but it's still going to take like 6 hours before it's completely cured. Okay, so got my gloves on, which is good. I'm just going to take some Gorilla Tape or just some sort of duct tape will work just fine. Duct tape, Gorilla Tape, anything that's a good quality tape that'll stick. And I'm just sticking this on here because I want to make sure that it doesn't leak. And I'm going to do the same thing with our little nipple here. I've actually got way more tape than I need. I've also got a little cup here. And I'm basically going to put all of this epoxy in the cup. Because I'm using all of it, I don't have to worry about making sure that they start at the same time. And I'm going to go ahead and mix this up to where it's one consistent color gray. We want to work as fast as we can because we want this to be as liquid as possible. If I had a disposable syringe, I would use it. I'll try to get it right down the middle. That's not good. I'm going to go ahead and stop this because what followed was a true fiasco of comic proportions. It was just one ridiculous disaster after another. And when I finally got it filled up, cured, and pulled the tape off, you can see in there or not. This is well, basically it's hollow to about there. So I'm just gonna start over again. Notice I'm using a longer stick this time. To stop really big globs from going in there. Okay, that went much better. That just proves that that was just one weird aberration. The two that I've done before this worked fine, or the two that I've done before the disaster worked fine, and then this one worked fine, so just that one. I will say, smaller pieces of tape on just one piece and not the two pieces together, a big advantage over what I did before. Just want to get that top as smooth as I can without making a divot. Okay. And for the future, you can see this one turned out fine. I did this, and I'm going to go back and edit this into what had happened before, so there may be some strange editing where things don't look the same, but it should all be fine. So now we have to wait 6 hours for this. In the meantime, let's go ahead and cut our PVC pipe to 3 5/8 inch. So let's mark that. So 3 5/8 inches. Let's go ahead and cut this, and I'll do that on a bandsaw again. So here is this piece, and well, you know what? Since we're already going to have to wait 6 hours for the epoxy, let's go ahead and take care of this MDF. I went ahead and just cut a couple of pieces out of it. These are just basically 3 by 3 inch squares. As long as it's above, more than 2 inches squared, it should be fine. If you don't do this now, you can easily use super glue, right before you need to use this, but we have plenty of time, so might as well get this going. Make sure you want to make sure it has very good coverage. You don't want there to be any part of this that is not glued. And normally I would then let this soak into the wood for a few seconds, and then maybe 30 seconds, and then put another coat of glue on there. But this MDF is completely coated or completely saturated with glue already. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's already, sealed. It's not going to soak up any more of that glue. By putting that first clamp in the middle, it just kept it from sliding around. Okay. Now this needs to, since it's wood glue, it needs to cure for about 24 hours, but we have plenty of time with the 6 hours here, and then the amount of work that we need to do this before we get around to using this. We'll be fine. When something's cured, we'll be back. Okay, it's been 6 more hours, and this is all good to go. It's got a little bit of a divot in here. It kind of shrunk down a little bit, but that's going to be totally fine for this. It's not fine for this piece here. If you've got a little divot, you want to go ahead and fill that with this. I had that with this as well. I just took some of this steel reinforced epoxy putty, just a tiny little bit of it, and put it in here. This cures in about 1 hour and can be drilled and sanded after that. Could you use this for this? Just fill it entirely with this? Yes, you could. That would work totally fine. And it would take a lot less time to do it. But I don't think you could do it for this. I think you have a hard time packing all the putty all the way through this. So that's why I went with the liquid. But just to reiterate, this one you want to be completely smooth. This one's fine if there's too much or too little epoxy at the very ends. And as for this, we can just put it aside. It's got a couple more hours that it needs. There we go. And that's absolutely fine. We're ready to go to the next step. Okay, so in truth, we made this just a little bit long. So in order to make a nice clean edge on both of these ends, I'm going to just saw off about 1/8 of an inch on both ends. You can easily do this with a miter box and a handsaw. This is just a little bit faster. I'm not really measuring, I'm just kind of looking at how much of a divot there is at the end, and making sure that I'm taking just that much off. Yep. That looks pretty good. It's good. This one's actually pretty good shape, but it's still got a little bit of a divot in there, so I'm going to take that off as well. But I just need to take the smallest amount off here. Okay, so now you can see we've got a good edge there. That's it. And we can go ahead and start drilling. Before we mark this, when I put the epoxy putty on the end of this, it was actually sticking out a little bit, and I showed cleaning that up, but then that's before I started over. So basically it was a little bit of epoxy sticking up above the top of this, so I just took some 220 grit sandpaper and just cleaned it up doing this. Doesn't take that long actually, and that's the way I got this to where it's perfectly flat on both ends. Now I can go on to marking. So I want to go ahead and mark the ends of these precisely in the middle. And I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to measure this. It's a little more, it's like, I'd say that's 13/16 probably. And I want to get sort of in the middle. I'm going to say about 3/8. You don't have to be super precise with this. I just moved my calipers, or my compass here. This is not a great compass for this kind of thing. Okay, that seems to be reasonably solid. And I'm just gonna take my thumb and hold it on the edge and make a mark. I'm gonna go to the opposite side, and I'm gonna hold the end and make a mark again. And they're not touching. There we go, there's the marks. And you see they're not touching, but they're close together. Now I'm going to go 90 degrees to where I did before. And there's various ways of doing this, various versions. Go 90 degrees again, or I guess 180 degrees from the last one. There we go. You can see that we basically made a little square in the middle, and that's going to be the precise center. You can also do this with, you know, just 3 arcs, sort of one here, and one, you know, over here. It's just, this is, for me, this is faster just to not think about it and just kind of do it. We'll repeat the process on the back. Do the same thing here. Oh, I can't do the same thing here. That'd be a much bigger square. This is just over a half, maybe 9/16. So 1/4 is going to be enough, close enough for that. So you don't have to be exactly the middle. If you're a little over, that works just as well as if you're a little under. Both ways it'll give you a little square or triangle depending on how many arcs you use. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get to some good light and put a mark right in the middle of each of these. See if I can't bring some of the good light with me here. Hopefully it doesn't blow out the camera. And you can see I just put a little black mark with a marker in the middle of that square. I'm just going to use this scratch awl. Get as close as I can. Do the same thing over here. It looks pretty good. Okay, and I already did this one over there. So now we can really go start the drill. So this is my drill press, and if you don't have a drill press and you've been looking for a reason to get one, this project is that time. You can do this part with a hand drill without too much trouble, but later on there's going to be some things that would be a lot easier with a drill press. In fact, we'll get to that later. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my table here to where it's just almost touching. Okay, I just put this much smaller bit in because the 1/4-inch bit that I had before was never going to kind of engage into the little divot that I put in with my punch. So now this will definitely kind of sticks in place there. And this is the way I usually do it. I take my piece and I hold it up to the bit and get it to where it sticks in place. And then I rotate this down to where it's sitting flat. And then I lift up. And it has tendency to, if there's a little tension on there, like if I've moved it a little bit off center, when I lift up, it'll move it into the right place. Now I can hold this, and I'm just going to go about halfway to 3/4 of the way through here. Go slowly. And now I'm going to flip it around and do the exact same thing on the other side. The reason why I'm doing that is because even with the drill press, it's not super accurate and there is some distortion to the bit itself. So by doing this, I know that at least that part's in the center and this part will be in the center. And if it's a little off, it'll be in the middle. And if you can see, that gives us a little thin guide hole. And we can go ahead and do this again with the 1/4-inch bit. Okay, now I have the 1/4-inch bit back in, and I'm going to do the same things I did with the smaller bit. It's just that now this will sort of engage into that hole that I made with the smaller bit. And move slowly, especially when I'm holding this by hand. flip it over and do the same thing. The bits that I have a little part that sticks out of the bottom that actually in this case is making it a little bit difficult to get it perfectly in the center. Because usually if you have one that just comes down to a point, then that's going to sort of self-center itself into the hole. Okay, now we have what should be a hole drilled directly down the middle. I think mine's a little off because of this little pilot part of this bit. I think in my previous piece I used a standard bit, but this will work out just fine. I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other piece, so I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the smaller bit. Okay, I've switched over to a small bit. In fact, I've switched over to my standard bit instead of the one with that pilot extension on there. And just like before, I want to kind of lift this up to the bit until it is, secure in the right hole, in that little divot that we made. I'm going to push it down, and I want to do this until it doesn't move. There we go. Definitely moving around a bit there, but I think it's going to be okay. The hole still looks pretty central. Okay, now I have the 1/4 inch bit in, and I'm just going to do the same thing. So it moved that way, so I need to pull the whole thing back this way. If I had a vise to hold this perfectly straight up and down, I would use it, but I don't have anything like that, so I'm just going to hold it. Okay, so if we can, there we go. So you might be asking yourself, what's the point of going through all the trouble of filling these with epoxy and trying to drill them out perfectly centered? Well, we're trying to avoid a couple things. Here's the first prototype that I made, and a couple things. One thing, it's really easy to push all this stuff, so that it's weird. I tried filling it with hot glue, but even then there's quite a bit of movement that you can get with it. Also, if you notice, I have to use washers in these odd places because these pieces will kind of force themselves into each other. And it's kind of a pain. I've messed with it quite a bit and decided it just wasn't worth it. You can kind of compare this one, which is my first prototype, to this one, which is the second prototype, and you see how much more solid this one is. It can't move off center. It's not super tight. That does, slide on there, but nothing can move out of position. So this is definitely a better way of doing things than this one is. Okay, so what we're going to do now is make a measurement 5/16 out from the end. That's about 8 millimeters. Just about right there. I'm going to go ahead and cut this in a bandsaw. Okay, so now we have this little piece here, and we need to measure and cut this piece again, this time at 4 inches. Oh, okay. Apparently with all the stuff I've been working on, it's almost exactly 4 inches. So you might want to be a little bit more careful with your cutting. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and just shave that little bit off, and that way we'll have 4 inches here. Okay, with that tiny amount gone, that's 4 inches. And we're almost ready to start putting some stuff together here. One last thing to do here. And so we're back over to the drill press. Now this bit is 21/64, which is exactly the measurement that I get on the widest part of this square piece that sticks down. So from corner to corner is 21/64. And I have the exact size bit for that. That'll give me a nice snug fit. If I didn't have that, I would just go for the next size up. Okay, and now I don't want to go all the way through here. I want to keep that 1/4 inch hole intact on one side. And I just want to go deep enough that I can make this fit onto the carriage bolt. I'm going to track this on 2 axes to make sure that it doesn't move. I'm going to hold it as tight as I can, and I'm just going to move real slowly. Okay, and let's just check this and see if it fits. Okay, and it needs to come, if I can, there we go. It needs to go just a tiny bit deeper. I could have, I suppose, measured the depth of that and set my depth gauge for there, but I didn't think about that until just now. And you can see that it fits nice and snug there. Still has the 1/4 inch hole there, so it'll be nice and rock solid. It's going nowhere. Now we can start putting some things together. First we have this little piece here, and then goes the nipple piece, and then the 4 inch section. And that doesn't look like much yet, but that's a pretty good chunk. Now we get to start messing with this piece of PVC. So what we need to do now with our piece of PVC here is we need to cut it very accurately in half. And the way I'm going to do that is using this. This is a piece of my MDF. It's precisely 2 inches thick here. That's just going to help when I start trying to measure this out. And I've got a piece of double stick tape here, and what I'm going to do is lay that flat. Then I'm going to take my PVC and I'm going to lay it flat and stick it on here. Make sure it sticks really well. And it's important that they're both flat. You don't just want to stick them together up here. They need to be flat. That way they'll be perfectly stable when we put this on the bandsaw. What we're trying to do here is to avoid any turning of the PVC pipe while it's being cut down here, because we want it to be a nice straight cut, and we don't want any twist in that cut. Next, we're going to measure the diameter of this. And it is, I guess, 1 1/16 of an inch. So I can use that to set my bandsaw to half of that, so a half and a 64th. So 33/64. Okay, I've got my everything set up here. I got my distance on my fence, and I can double check that by using the 2-inch piece of wood. That is 1/64 past a half of an inch. So we're good there. And now we can go ahead and just rip this down the middle. Now, while this is still attached to the board, I'm going to take this piece and just put a mark on it. Just to tell me that this is the piece. This is perfectly 1/2. This is 1/2 minus twice the width of the blade here, because it cut through on this side and that side. So it's slightly shorter than this piece. Next, I need to measure 1 1/4 inches on both of these pieces and mark that. That's roughly 32 millimeters. Now I'm going to go ahead and run over to the bandsaw and just cut these off. Be right back. Before I cut this off, let me show you that I went ahead and put an X on this piece also, so I know that this is the smaller piece than this piece. So here are our pieces. We have our taller pieces and our shorter pieces. And you want to take your irrigation pipe and these small of the two pieces that are the half, not the ones that are a little smaller. And basically, it doesn't matter which end. I'm just going to glue this on flush at the back. Now, in the past, this is wanted to stick on or just kind of clamp on. It's not doing it this time, so let me go grab a clamp just to make sure. Super glue should work just fine. I don't know what this irrigation pipe is made of. Otherwise, if it was also PVC, I would say you could go ahead and use PVC glue for that. But I haven't had any problems at all with super glue. Make sure that it's nice and flush across there. Put the clamp on. And just wait a few seconds. Now I'm back to this PVC pipe again, and I'm going to cut a 1/4 inch piece of this and a 1/8 inch piece of this. So we'll have two little rings, one 1/8 of an inch and one 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to do it on the bandsaw, and I'll be right back. So here's our two rings. And if you'll notice, I also cut into them so that they're, you can open them up a little bit. That's because these won't actually fit onto this without being able to open them up a little bit. And let's go ahead and put this top piece on. You have a choice at this point. We can either put this actual piece on and then try to fill these gaps, or what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take that PVC and I'm going to cut it in half again, just like I did here, but I'm going to do it a little bit more than a half. So I'm using the same blocks I did before, and you know, I don't need to cut this whole piece. I'm going to cut a small piece of this off real quick. Okay, so this is a 1 1/4 inch piece. This is the same size as this piece and that piece. It's also 32 millimeters. Yeah, that's correct. And I'm going to stick this little piece onto this block, just like we did before. And I think what we're going to do here is let's cut this piece a little more than halfway. So like what I'll do is I'll cut, this is 2 inches. So I'm going to go with 3/8 of an inch. So we'll cut this at 2 3/8 of an inch, which will give us, you know, an 1/8 of an inch more than half of this, basically. Okay, so I've cut 3/8 of an inch off of the end of this piece here, and this is going to be almost certainly too big, but let's see how it fits. Yeah, so it's clearly too big, but I want to sand this down until it fits. If you have a belt sander, this would be a good time to use it. Now remember, you're removing it from both sides, so it's, if you remove 1/8 of an inch, you're really removing 2/8 of an inch. It's better, but we're still a bit big. If this were 120 grit sandpaper, this would go a little faster. 60 grit, it's quite a bit more coarse, but it's good to change how you're holding it every so often, so that you don't end up putting more pressure in one area and ending up with, you know, shorter on one end and longer at the other. That's just barely too big. You could actually get away with this, but I'm going to go just a little bit more. What I don't want to do is make it too small. I think I'm going to go back to the 220 grit, just to smooth everything else out good. And that looks good. And we can go ahead and glue this piece in place. Again, make sure that it's probably better to make sure that it's flush in the up here than in the back, because I can always sand this off pretty easily in the back, but I can't sand this front part off very easily. Hit it with some zip kicker real quick. Now we can take our 1/8 inch spacer. I've got some glue. I'm going to clean up some glue that's here on the edge here. I'm going to take a little file and let's see, I should have concentrated the glue on this edge here and here, and that would be mostly what's holding everything on. Okay, we're not assembling a watch, so it doesn't have to be perfect. I just want to be able to push this flush up against it. And this is basically just a spacer so that we can make a mark. And that's going to tell us where we can add, or where we can go ahead and glue this piece. This is the longer of the ones that doesn't have an X on it. See if I can use less glue and keep it further away from the edges. And I'm pouring it all over my hand. Pretty sure I got that on the line pretty well. Now I'm going to clean all the super glue I just poured over my hands off. Now I do think that the PVC will give you the best results, but it's also hard to split a piece of PVC down the middle, and you may not want to go through that trouble, or you may not have the equipment for it. So an alternative is to go with foam. This is 4mm foam. You can either use craft foam, or this is 4mm thick EVA foam, which honestly I think is the same thing. Just one comes in like a sheet, and another one is, it can be in a roll. And I just have 2 strips that I cut out. I have this piece, which is 2 3/8 of an inch, or 60mm across here, and this one's just 1 1/4 inch, which is 32mm. But I just have 2 strips. I also have just a piece of paper that I cut out of my pattern. And I'm just going to take my piece of irrigation pipe that we've already drilled a hole in. I'm going to take my strip of paper, and I'm just going to wrap it around just a little past, all the way around, and I can tear that off. I'm just going to take a piece of tape and tape it so it's nice and tight on here. Now just take an X-Acto knife or a razor blade or whatever knife you've got, and I'm just going to cut through both pieces of paper where it's overlapped, all the way through to the irrigation pipe. Be careful. Now once you take your 2 little pieces off, one that's been taped on and one that's just loose, you have the exact circumference of the pipe. Now granted, this is the internal, or this will be the internal diameter of the foam, not the external, so we're going to want to add a little bit of length onto this. And right now we're just working with the small piece. So I've got my barge cement and my ruler. I'm just going to basically pick one side or the other and lay this on my foam. Easier said than done. And then I'm just going to add to that 3/8 of an inch, which is roughly 9mm. Let's see, make 2 marks. That is just under 3 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that out. Okay, so here's my piece cut out. And I'm just going to take a little bit of barge glue. And I'm just going to hit the end of it. This is barge cement, in case you haven't come across this before, although I'm sure you have on other videos. It's just a contact cement. It's a very good contact cement. If you can't find barge cement, you can use contact cement, but I would use put on one coat, let it dry, and then put on a second coat. I often do that with the barge cement as well, but it's not really that necessary. Okay, so I'm going to let this dry for about 5 minutes. Okay, I'm just going to check. Yep, it's completely dry. I like it to be a little bit tacky actually, but let's see if this works anyway. Now I'm just going to bend these back on itself, and it really kind of helps to press down on the table here. And I really want to make sure that I catch the bottom edge first and as even as I can, because as soon as it touches, it's going to stick. And then push it all the way forward, and we get a good connection. You can kind of make a happy face with it, with the seam on the top, and that kind of pushes the outside edge together good. And that's probably a good enough connection on its own. If it starts to pull apart on you, then you might need to wait a couple hours for the glue to completely cure, but it's pretty quick usually. Yeah, and that's, we can just slide that right on, make sure it's flush. Because the big problem you have with foam, because it's not rigid, it's easy to get kind of a wavy, edge. And once you're happy with where it is, I've just got some of the not gel super glue, but regular super glue, and you can just kind of stick the nozzle in there a little bit and give it a little squirt. Kind of run a little bead all the way around it. Just don't get very much on there. If all you have is the gel type, you can use that also. It's just not going to soak in between the foam and the pipe as easily. I'm going to try to get in the back as well just a little bit. It's a little easier on this side because if I get a little too much on the outside, I can always just take some sandpaper and smooth everything out good. And I'm just going to let that dry for about a minute. Okay, it's been about a minute. I could have used the zip kicker on that, but I've got it in the house. So it's well secured, it's not going anywhere. And since we have a seam on this, this just became the bottom. Now we have this piece, and all we need to do is to cut a piece of this that's exactly half of the size that we used for this piece. So this one was a 30-second underneath 3. So we'll make it be close enough. We'll just go ahead and make this one 1.5 inches. So we'll cut a 1.5 inch section off of this. Okay, so this is 1.5 inches long, or roughly 38 millimeters. And So we can always use our 1/8 inch ring, but we're trying to avoid not working with the PVC pipe, so I guess that's out of the question. So let's just mark 1/8 of an inch in a few different places on here. And using those marks, we can go ahead and we could use the barge cement again, to be honest. That would give us a good connection, or we could just use the super glue. But the important thing is we want to make sure we get a nice square edge, or a nice parallel line between these two lines, and that'll make sure that everything is straight across. But if we're going to use the super glue, I'm going to go with the gel super glue because it gives me a little bit more time to work. So I'm just going to put a little bit along the outside, not right on the edge, just because I don't want it to get all over my fingers. And I'll put a little bit down the middle as well, just to hold everything flat. Making this basically the middle, or the bottom. Make those look like they're nice and even, and then I can walk the rest of this down. And that should give you pretty close to the same setup as I use in the PVC. This looks good and would work fine, but I think you might be a little better off if you added, I'd say go with half of what this is, but then add another 1/8 of an inch onto that. And that will give you, this would still work, but 1/8 of an inch would be a little bit more straight across. So go with half of the length that you used for this piece, but then on top of that add another 1/8 of an inch. Now we can get back on with it. Okay, so I'm just going to take, I think maybe the 1/4 inch one will work better for this. So take the 1/4 inch one, put the slot on the bottom because we already have that marked. And the advantage of having the 1/4 inch one is that I can line it up with the end here. Maybe something a little smoother. And then we want to make our mark right along here. Now that we have our two marks, they're a little different in that on this mark we'll be lining up against it, and on this mark we'll actually be covering up that mark basically. But we have our start and end points here. We can go ahead and have some fun with this piece and the heat gun. So I've just got my piece of PVC pipe here, the smaller, the shorter piece that put the X on. I've just got it sitting on a piece of steel here, just because I know that that's not going to get damaged by the heat. What we're getting ready to do here is to make these little strips. There's 4 pieces that go along the top of this, and I'm going to make them out of this PVC. And then I'm going to cut them out of the bandsaw. If you don't want to do that, you can. I found that this will probably work pretty well. This is just a mat board. You can find mat board at you know, frame shops or art supply stores, or you know, hobby stores. A lot of them will sell mat board. This is just a 1/16 of an inch thick, so I, you know, cut a piece in half and glued it together. I did one test using just a white Elmer's glue, PVA glue, the school glue, so like for paper and stuff. And the other half I did with super glue, and then I cut these two little strips out. It works just fine, both cases. And just cut them out with an X-Acto knife, so it's pretty straightforward. I think it took about 8 cuts with the X-Acto knife to get through, which was no big deal. And it's nice and rigid. You could also cut this out of 3mm EVA foam, but those are so flimsy, you know, it's so movable, flexible, that it's hard to get a perfectly straight line when you're gluing it onto this piece here. You won't get like a perfectly straight strip here. You'll get like a little, you know, waviness to it. So I wouldn't suggest that, but it's something you can do if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and use this PVC because I'm trying to make it with as few materials as possible. But like I said, if you don't want to use, I'm going to cut this out with a bandsaw. You could also use a coping saw to cut the strips out. But if you don't want to go for that trouble, you know, a couple pieces of 1/16 inch mat board glued together works fine. Now with that out of the way, I've just got my heat gun set about 80%. Actually, you know what? PVC is a little denser, so let's go full blast. Notice I'm not wearing gloves this time, but I do have a little block of wood. Let's get a little more. Okay, now I have a nice flat piece of PVC and probably a really hot piece of metal. Not too bad. Now we just need to measure this and then we can cut it out. Okay, but we want to cut these out at 5 30-seconds, which is just 1 32nd over 1/8, or about 4 millimeters. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to set the fence on my bandsaw to this size and then just run off several. You want to have probably 6 of these little pieces, 4 as your actual pieces and 2 as spacers. So here's our 6 pieces. Alternatively, if you want to go with the mat board, like I said, this is just 2 pieces of 1/16 of an inch thick mat board glued together. Use X-Acto knife or box cutter, as long as it's got a good blade. This is definitely a time you want to use a new blade. Okay, so I'm holding that and just don't try to go through in one one pass, which is how I was taught in school, but multiple. You don't have to bear down so hard. Just multiple small cuts will work just fine. Putting all the effort into this hand, pushing down on the straight edge, not on this hand pushing down on the blade. And ideally, you do this with a about a 15-inch long piece. Nope, didn't quite get there. So if you did this with a 15-inch long piece, then you could just go back in there and cut your, your little sections out, and you could do it. They'd all be uniform width and everything. Let's go ahead and measure our 2 3/8. I know you can see with the camera, but it's dark over here. I can't see what I'm doing. 2 3/8. Okay, and then I can use that piece to measure the next pieces. But you do want to use the same piece to measure the other pieces. If you cut this piece and then use it to measure this piece, and then cut this piece to use and measure the next piece, eventually you'll end up with a completely different size. So you always want to use the same piece to measure your size with. Okay, there's 3 of your 6 pieces that you want, but there you go. Now that we have our strips cut out, it's just a matter of gluing them onto here. And this is where your little rings are going to help quite a bit. Take your little skinny 1/8 of an inch one, and you have to really pull it, kind of force it, but it will definitely spring apart. So put that on there. Slide the 1/4 inch one on the end. This is going to help us to make sure we're nice and even when we put these on. Make sure that all your strips are in the same orientation. They should be slightly rectangular in cross section. So you want them to be a little bit wider than they are tall. I just want to grab one of them and line them up here. Then take my pen and I'm just going to draw a line. Okay, so now I know where to go ahead and add the next one on. Now, if your strips shrink a little bit, which can definitely happen with the PVC when you heat it up, sometimes it'll shrink a little bit. And if it does, I would suggest lining it up with this back piece. And if it's a little short in the front, that's okay. It's going to be not as easy to see. You won't notice it as much. But in the back, you definitely want to line it up evenly across this back section here. You can, of course, just leave a piece down here and glue the next piece above that. There is a chance that you're going to end up gluing this one down, but not that much. You should be able to pop it up. So let's go ahead and try that. You want to be fairly, don't put a lot of glue on. I'm using this gel. I need to shake it up. so it's not going to be running all over the place. So for this, I would definitely suggest the gel. I'm going to put just a little. About 4 little beads on there. My spacer fell off. I've got one of my scrap spacers, and I'm just going to spread that out a little bit because it was a pretty big glob. So I've got my spacer in place, and I can just drop this in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pop this spacer out while it's not glued in place. Make sure there's no glue there. Put my spacer back. Add some more glue. Just make sure it was the right orientation. I keep getting real heavy with the glue in that first little spot. Spacers in place. Had to get a little leverage to pop that piece out. Now that you have these two in, instead of going on and doing this one, we're going to switch over and we'll go to this side and do this side. So we have a spacer there. It's also good occasionally to spin your little rings to make sure they're not glued in place. Okay, and there we go, we're pretty good. So now that we have all of our pieces in here, we can go ahead and pop the rings off. Oh, now if you're doing this with the mat board, then you want to be really careful with your glue, because if you glue your spacer in place, it's not going to want to just pop out. It's going to, it's made of paper, so it's going to tear. So just be careful when you're gluing it down that you don't get any excess glue anywhere. And you can always, if it does tear, you can easily clean that out. So that's one of the most difficult parts of the whole build right there, and you're done. Hey, if you like this video or found it helpful, why not go ahead and give it a thumbs up? And of course, subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming videos. You can also click that little bell so you'll be instantly notified when new videos come out. As always, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them down below in the comments section and I'll do my best to answer them. It's really your likes, comments, and subscriptions that motivate me to keep this channel going. So until next time, thanks. We'll try to get it right down the middle. That's not good. It's not generally this difficult to do. hesitate to even show this because this is not how it's usually easy. Just pour it in there. Now I've touched the... So needless to say, try not to touch the tape. I'm going to cut this piece of tape. This is like a comedy act. I swear this is easier than this. I'm really glad that I actually wore my gloves for once. If I can, that's pretty much started to harden up, so we're going to work with what we got here. It's going to be fine. So now we can wait 6 hours for this to cure, and hopefully the comedy portion of this is completed and we can get on with it. So I'll be back in 6 hours. Okay, this is definitely not gone to plan. Just the curse of trying to film something.